We are back to looking at exposure this week. I uploaded a video looking at context and themes last week, but we need to get to the nitty-gritty of the author's methods, so the way that they construct the poem and the way that they use language for effect. I'll also be making some links to Bayonet Charge, seeming as that fits in with the themes of the futility of war, the horrors of war, issues to do with patriotism, that we've already had a little look at in exposure. So I'll start making quite a few links to that one, particularly because we've been carrying on with this theme of representations of war through poppies and war photographer as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you some terminology which is really, really important for exposure in particular. And what would be really, really helpful to do would be to pause the video once you're looking at the terminology and to look at the poems for yourselves and actually look to see if you can find those features and begin to think independently what kind of effect those features have. So we've got here, number one, most important, personification. So exposure is very much based on the personification in the poem. So have a little look to see if you can see what Wilfred Owen is personifying and the effect of that imagery as well. And then the next three are all to do with sound. It's to do with the structure of the poem as well as the kind of the language. So alliteration, assonance and sibilance are all to do with the repetition of different kinds of sounds in words. So alliteration is probably one you know really, really well. It's to do with the repetition of sounds at the beginning of words. So in exposure we've got wearied we keep awake. So I'm saying sounds because it's not always the very first letter of the word. So wearied we keep awake repeats that W sound, and in the word awake it's actually the second letter, so it's sounds, not just letters. We've got assonance, which is to do with the repetition of vowel sounds. So once again, looking at exposure, we can see that all the way through. Gusts tugging on the wire. So vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and you've got the repetition of the U sounds in gusts tugging. And then sibilance is the repetition of soft consonants, particularly S's. So we can see that in the very first line. Merciless, iced east winds. And once again, sibilance can come anywhere in the word. It doesn't just have to be at the beginning. So merciless, iced east winds, that repetition of the S sounds comes in different parts of each of those words. And what I want you to think about, what we'll come to later, is the way that those three techniques, alliteration, assonance and sibilance, work together and what effect that might have throughout the poem. We've got, very obviously, first thing that we should see when we look at the shape of the poem is the fact that it uses repetition. So not just repetition through that repeated line of but nothing happens, but the fact that every stanza has what we might call a refrain. So a refrain is a little bit like a chorus in a song. It's something that it's a repeated pattern. So we have this repeated pattern throughout the poem of having 4 extended lines of about 13 or 14 syllables, and then one short blunt line at the end. So we can call that final 5th line of each stanza a refrain. And then we've also got things like the rhetorical questions, and then I ran out of space here so I had to add a couple more. We've got verbs, so the use of the verbs, which kind of links to the personification, and we've got the use of juxtaposition in the poem as well. So it'd be a good time now to pause this video, to keep that list up in front of you, and to annotate your poem looking for those different techniques. Now that we've looked at the terminology, we need to think more about the overall effect of those techniques within the poem as a whole. So I will go through some of the important lines in the poem, some really good quotations for you to remember, because in the exam you've only got one poem in front of you, and it could be any one poem from the whole collection of 15. So you need to know all poems fairly well, knowing quotations at the top of your head, knowing them off by heart, in case that's going to be the best poem to link to. So the more that you can actually remember, the more kind of memorable quotations that you can already start sort of putting on post-it notes and putting them around your house so that you can learn them, the better. Let's begin with the first stanza of Exposure, because this poem does go through a journey. There are changes that happen in the poem, and that's really, really important to note when you are talking about the structure of the poem. You can talk about the way that it develops, and in Exposure we go through this journey with the soldiers as they suffer in the trenches due to the conditions, due to the wind and the rain that gives them this physical condition of exposure. So we begin with them suffering, and it's describing the weather, but then it progressively becomes more acute, it becomes worse. So by the time we get to the third stanza, you can even see that growing acuteness of the weather, because it says the poignant misery of dawn begins to grow, and as the poem says it's beginning to grow, the more serious the weather is becoming. And by the time we get to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th and 6th stanzas, the soldiers are really beginning to lose their sanity. They're beginning to become quite delirious and mad because of the physical suffering that they are going through. And then a very important turning point in the poem. In some poetry we might even call it a Volta, like a turning point. So if you want to go away and research that word, I'll write it down for you. A Volta. You traditionally find a Volta, an important change in a poem, in a sonnet form of poem, but I don't see any harm in using that term for an important change of tone or important message in any poem. So in the penultimate stanza, in the 7th stanza, there's a change because there's a very serious message there about the soldiers losing faith in that penultimate stanza, before the very final stanza, which is the soldiers burying their friends because they have died of exposure. So you can see the structure of this poem takes us through those 8 stanzas towards the final moment of the soldiers dying. So we can really see how Wilfred Owen uses that transition, uses that change to kind of build up to that climactic point at the very end of the poem to make this more emotive in terms, so emotional, emotive, in terms of the message that he's trying to convey about the futility of war. The first stanza. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knive us. Straight away, loads to zoom in on. Before we zoom in on the imagery, I want us to look at that second person pronoun our. In Poppies, the dramatic monologue, we had the first person pronoun I, and then in War Photographer we had the third person pronoun he, and in this one we've got a second person pronoun, so really nice selection of voices for us to think about. So think about the importance, the significance of including other people in this poem. Why is he saying our and we? To me, what I interpret from that is that there's a sense of camaraderie, which is like masculine kind of brotherhood between the soldiers that Wilfred Owen wants to convey. He wants to show that it's not just one person suffering, it's the whole collection of men who are suffering as part of their duty to their country. So he uses that inclusive pronoun. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knive us. So you could zoom in on that verb knive us. Straight away we've got personification as well. It's the iced east winds that appear to be using this weaponry, and the fact that Wilfred Owen is giving the weather the weapons is really important for us, because straight away it kind of shows us that the enemy which the soldiers are facing isn't the opposite army, it's actually the weather conditions themselves, which would be quite shocking and quite political for Wilfred Owen to write about, because it would be expected for soldiers to be writing very patriotic poems about the glory and the heroism of soldiers, and instead here we have the soldiers being made to seem really weak by the fact that the wind is attacking them. You could look at the exaggeration or the hyperbole of suffering in that first phrase, our brains ache. So it's not just talking about their flesh, their hands, their fingers, their noses, all of those extremities that get cold in cold weather. It's talking about the brain, so that it really is that kind of deep suffering. Wearied we keep awake, so we've got the alliterative W sound there, because the night is silent, and there's quite a lot of emphasis on that kind of stillness, that silence through this poem, which to my mind, in my interpretation, it's reflected in all of the sound imagery. So if you listen to there's another use of the word silence here. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. That theme of silence is carried through in the kinds of sounds that Wilfred Owen is using. So that sibilant sound in the listing, so there's listing in this poem as well, of that fourth line in the first stanza, reflects the fact that the soldiers are just suffering in silence, and that perhaps links to that theme of truth and lies in the title Exposure, that Wilfred Owen feels as though the soldiers are being silenced. They're not being allowed to talk about the fact that this war is futile. So remember all of the context here that I talked about in my last video about the fact that we expect soldiers to be patriotic and heroic, and actually Wilfred Owen wants to expose all of the lies behind that. He wants to show how this war was a waste of life. And that is emphasised in that final line, but nothing happens. So if we look at the syllables there, but nothing happens, 5 syllables in that particular line, what are we doing here? So 6 syllables, is it that we are dying? So about 5 to 7 syllables in those final lines, that refrain at the end of each stanza. But also, not only are they shorter, but they're also very blunt messages at the end of each stanza, and that's reflected once again through the sounds used in the words. So whereas we had the soft sibilant sounds through the first 4 lines of the stanza, we then have plosive consonants in the final stanza. But, plosive B, nothing, plosive N, happens, plosive T, P's. So plosive sounds are any hard consonants in the poem. And I think once again that's exaggerating or emphasising or highlighting the fact that these soldiers feel powerless. Second stanza. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, the mad gusts. So that word mad kind of emphasising how out of control this war feels, how pointless it feels. And the fact that they've got personification again, the tugging, the verb tugging on the wire. The weather is a very powerful force, whereas the verbs and the imagery used to do with the soldiers is very powerless. So you've got twitching agonies of men in the next line. So you could look at that word twitching and how emotive it is, because it shows that physical representation of the horrors of war. And the adjectives here are interesting as well. So throughout this stanza, flickering, gunnery, rumble, so that adjective flickering, and that sound, like it's like in the previous stanza we had the fact that the trenches were silent. Here we just have the rumbling of the gunnery. So the final, well, the penultimate line of this stanza, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. It's showing how, like, the tone of that line is so despondent. It's suggesting that war is far away, like the army are a distant rumour. It's really exaggerating how important the weather is compared to the other army, which just completely seems topsy-turvy to us. We would expect the army to be the main danger here, but instead it uses that idea that it's a distant rumour. So it's actually kind of using the opposite of emphasis there, a dull rumour. And I think there's some terminology actually for that idea of something that's not an emphasis. I'll look that up and I'll return to that in one of my next videos. And then the rhetorical question, which once again just seems so despondent, so hopeless. What are we doing here? And that links to that theme of futility that we talked about in the last video. The poignant misery of dawn. So here we have the imagery of dawn, and you could look at the connotations of the word dawn next to the poignant misery. So it's using the adjectives of the poignant misery to describe dawn. And that's where we have juxtaposition. So Wilfred Owen is using juxtaposition here to exaggerate how hopeless the soldier's situation is. And we have these ellipses sometimes at the end of the lines as well, which I think suggest the idea of aimlessness as well. So the ellipses are the 3 dots at the end, and it makes me feel as though the soldiers don't know what they're aiming for, that they're purposeless. Personification again in the 3rd line of the 3rd stanza, dawn massing in the east her melancholy army. And some of my students pointed out the use of that female pronoun her to describe dawn, and that links to some of those issues of masculinity that we've seen in poems like War Photographer and Poppies. It's perhaps even showing how emasculated these soldiers are feeling. So if you're giving the weather this kind of female persona and the weather is attacking them, it shows how far we've come from that masculine, heroic stereotype of a soldier. Listing again in this stanza, so we only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. So you've got that list of 3 there, you've got the sibilants, really jam-packed full of different techniques for you to talk about. So this is a really, really good poem to memorise some lines from. And that's quite memorable as well, isn't it? We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. 4th stanza, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. So you could say that the repetitive sibilance there reflects the movement of the bullets. And once again, the repeated word silence there. Perhaps, once again, linking to this theme of the soldiers being silenced. They're not allowed to speak up about the suffering that they're experiencing. You've got more personification here to do with the snow as well, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. So the snow is being personified, the wind is being personified, and the wind is shown to be nonchalant. It's kind of got this arrogant, careless danger about it. It's being nonchalant, which is kind of like the binary opposite end of the feelings of the soldiers, and it makes the weather really seem like an enemy. It's nonchalant, it doesn't care that it's killing the soldiers. Personification again in the next stanza, pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. The repeated fricative F there, fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, so look at the verb there, cringe, making the soldier seem so powerless. And by the time we get to this part of the poem, we can see that the soldiers are beginning to kind of perhaps lose their minds. So you've got this idea of dreams, they're drowsing, and then you've got the repeated D sound there, we drowse, sun dozed, and that fits in as well with the fragmentation of the structure of the line. So you've got the caesura in the middle of the line, which perhaps shows that their minds are beginning to fragment as they're losing their health. and that's supported by that final line, is it that we are dying? So we do get the impression that actually they are dying, their mental capabilities are really degenerating in this line. And then the next couple of stanzas are really, really important for the overall message of the poem. Slowly our ghosts drag home. And this stanza can seem a little confusing. You've got these ces yeux with the colons in the middle of each of these 4 lines. Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed, with crusted dark red jewels, crickets jingle there. There are some very odd images here, and it is ambiguous. You can read into this stanza a little bit. I'm particularly interested in the sunk fires glozed. That reminds me of the home fires burning, and I think what for me this stanza is about is that the soldiers have kind of slipped into this sort of haze in the stanza just before, and they're kind of mixing up these images of the trenches and home, which is why you've got the innocent mice rejoicing, because there'd be lots of rodents in the trenches, and then this last line of the stanza, or the penultimate line of the stanza, which is really important: on us the doors are closed. So I get the impression that Wilfred Owen feels as though the politicians, the government, are closing the door on them. They're not helping them, they're not listening to them, they're being silenced. We turn back to our dying. And then this very important political penultimate stanza: since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn. So that home fires thing that I talked about in the other stanza, I think is continued here. That line is basically sort of saying we are told to believe that the home fires can't be kept burning if we don't go to war in this way, and I think he's trying to say that he's lost his faith in that patriotic ideal, and not only has he lost faith in that patriotic ideal, but he's also lost his faith in God, as we can see in that final line: for love of God seems dying. And then the final stanza is very, very emotive in terms of the physical horrors that we can see. So the shrivelling many hands, the puckering foreheads crisp, and the eyes are ice, and the assonance in that final line, all their eyes are ice, is really there to communicate the horror of what Wilfred Owen has seen, a little bit like we saw in War Photographer. I promised that I would talk a little bit about Bayonet Charge, but I think we've run out of time, so I'll do a separate video for that one. But before we look at Bayonet Charge, perhaps start looking at those very same techniques, because they're important in that one as well. So if we just have a look at Bayonet Charge very quickly, just finding it in my anthology. Here we go. This is one by Ted Hughes. Have a look at the way that past and present tense is used. Suddenly he awoke. Have a look for alliteration. Have a little look for the tone of the poem, use of metaphors, imagery to do with nature. And we've got some plosive sounds again in this one. So start reading ahead, ready for my next video on Bayonet Charge.